Sometimes life has its way of telling you to slow down. For me, that signal was burnout. Years of working in New York City had drained me completely, and I decided to escape to my father's farmhouse in Vermont. It was a quiet, cozy place perfect for regaining my strength. The green hills, the old barn, and a horse named Ridge, known as the wild spirit of the farm, made it special. My father used to say Ridge couldn't be tamed, and I felt like the stubborn stallion reflected something of myself. 2 weeks after I moved, time passed peacefully and uneventfully. I settled in, read books, and occasionally worked in the garden. But that tranquility was interrupted by the arrival of my nephew, Luke. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years, and my memories of him were of an awkward teenager who never missed a chance to tease me about my love for coffee. When I saw who was standing on the porch, I was momentarily speechless. Before me stood a tall, confident young man with a slight smirk and a gaze that seemed to say, "I've seen things." "Aunt Megan, are you going to let me in? Or should I sleep in the rain?" he quipped. We both laughed, and the awkwardness of the moment vanished. Luke was nothing like I'd expected, and that unsettled me. He wasn't a teenager anymore. He was a man with a broad smile and an inner strength that was hard to ignore. Later that day, Luke noticed Rich standing near the barn, as if guarding the farm. "Is that your horse?" he asked, glancing at the stallion. "More like he belongs to himself," I replied with a shrug. Rich doesn't trust anyone, but Luke took it as a challenge. By evening, he was at the barn with an apple in hand, whispering softly to the horse, who didn't even think about backing away. I watched from a distance, amazed at his patience. Something about this young man had changed in the years since I'd last seen him. He was confident without arrogance, kind yet reserved. "He trusts you," I said as I approached. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be untrusting," he replied with a smile. There was truth in his words. Luke had come here to find himself, and I could feel it with every moment we spent together. That night, we talked until late, sitting on the porch. I learned he had graduated from college but had no idea what to do next. He felt lost. But here, in this quiet place, it seemed like he was beginning to find some clarity. The next morning, I woke up to see him at the barn again, offering Rich another apple. The stallion took a few steps forward and accepted the treat. It was the beginning of a bond that I couldn't quite explain. Something told me this summer would bring more changes than I could have ever imagined. The sun was high in the sky, bathing the green fields of the farm in golden light. It was the perfect day to venture out into nature. Luke insisted that we take Ridge out for a walk. I hesitated. The stallion was known for his unpredictable nature, and I didn't want anything to go wrong, but Luke was persistent. He bridled the horse with confidence and led him through the gate while I walked alongside, keeping a close eye on every movement. "Still don't trust me?" he asked, glancing back over his shoulder. "I trust you," I shrugged, "but Ridge is another matter entirely." He smiled, and there was something disarming in that smile. Luke walked with ease, exuding confidence, seemingly unbothered by the way Ridge's powerful muscles tensed with every step. We crossed a small meadow and stopped at the edge of a field with tall grasses. Luke tied Ridge to a tree, and the horse began peacefully grazing, clearly enjoying the company. "Now it's your turn," he said, handing me the reins. "Are you joking?" I looked at him incredulously. "No. If you want to know Ridge, you have to get closer." I sighed and took the reins. As I approached the stallion, I felt his powerful breath against my hand. He turned his head toward me, his gaze calm and patient, as if saying, "Try me, I don't bite. See? He's not so bad," Luke said, leaning against a tree. We spent an hour there. I fed Ridge apples and laughed at how he managed to be both elegant and stubborn at the same time. Meanwhile, Luke shared stories from his childhood, how he built tree houses in the woods or raced bikes with friends. His voice was deep and steady, his words flowing like the warm summer day. When the sun began to set, we decided to head back. Luke suggested taking a shortcut through a narrower path. Suddenly, Ridge was startled by a loud noise. He jerked his head, and the reins slipped from my hands. I lost my balance and fell into the grass. Luke rushed to help me up. Are you okay? His voice was worried but gentle. Just a little shaken, I replied, trying to smile. Our eyes met. His hands were still holding me, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind rustled through the grass. Rich stood calmly nearby, and my heart was racing. Luke leaned in slightly, and I realized I couldn't look away. His lips brushed mine, a light, fleeting kiss. It was so unexpected yet felt so right. The kiss lasted only a second but left an impression that something had shifted. I'm sorry, he whispered, looking away. Don't be, I said, feeling warmth spread through me. We said nothing more. We walked back home in silence, each lost in thought, but with the new understanding that something between us had begun to change and it was impossible to ignore. The evening was quiet and cool. At sunset, the sky turned shades of crimson and gold. Luke suggested we build a campfire in the yard. I brought out an old blanket for us to sit on while he gathered dry branches from the edge of the woods. Ridge, meanwhile, stood peacefully near the barn as if keeping watch. The crackling sparks of the fire lit up our faces, and I wrapped myself in a sweater, trying to ward off the chilly breeze. Do you remember how we used to go camping? Luke asked suddenly, tossing another branch into the fire. Of course, I smiled at the memory. Your mom always banned you from getting near the fire, and yet you always found a way to break the rules. And you were always on my side, he noted, giving me a warm look. It feels like you were the only one who ever understood me. His words struck a chord. In the silence that followed, something new hung in the air, something I couldn't quite name but felt acutely. Luke leaned back against a wooden beam, and I watched the firelight dance across his face. He looked both confident and vulnerable at the same time, and for some reason, that moved me deeply. Have you ever felt like your life isn't really your own? He suddenly asked, staring into the fire. All the time, I admitted. Sometimes it feels like I'm just running from something, though I don't even know what it is. What if you're not running? His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but every word resonated deeply. What if you're just searching for the right place? My thoughts tangled. This wasn't just a conversation between two relatives. There was meaning in Luke's words that I couldn't ignore. The wind picked up, and I instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around myself, but Luke suddenly moved closer. You deserve more than just running, Megan, he said, looking straight into my eyes. You deserve to be happy. My heart tightened at his words. His voice was so sincere, so full of care, that I felt tears well up in my eyes. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't find the words. He lifted a hand, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so soft that I didn't pull away. His fingers lingered on my cheek for a moment, and I realized I didn't want him to stop. Luke, I began, but he leaned in closer and I didn't finish. His lips touched mine slowly, cautiously, as if he were waiting for permission. I felt his warmth, and for a moment, I forgot everything. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession, a moment where words became unnecessary. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine for a response. I'm sorry, he murmured, but I smiled and shook my head. Don't be, I said. We sat in silence for a long time, staring at the dying fire. There was a spark left in the air that couldn't disappear as easily as the flames. The next morning, the farm was wrapped in a mist that drifted over the hills, concealing the events of the previous night. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, trying to process what had happened by the campfire. Luke sat on the porch, lazily picking at the straw that Rich had pulled from the hay feeder. The silence between us wasn't strained, but it was unusual, like we were both afraid to disturb a fragile balance. The quiet, however, was broken by the loud barking of our dog, Jake. He ran toward the road where a dark figure suddenly appeared. The person walked with purpose, and after a moment, I recognized him. Trevor, an old friend of Luke's, had unexpectedly come for a visit. Well, this is a surprise, Luke muttered, standing up to greet him. Trevor approached, his eyes scanning the yard with a mix of curiosity and tension. After shaking hands, he nodded toward me with a polite, if reserved, smile. I thought I'd drop by. You mentioned you'd be here, he explained, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. The three of us spent the rest of the day together. Trevor shared stories about his travels and cracked jokes, but every now and then, he gave me a peculiar look. When Luke stepped out to the barn, Trevor and I were left alone in the kitchen. He stood up, walked to the table, and said without preamble, "You and Luke, I saw you by the campfire." My heart skipped a beat. What exactly did you see? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, enough to know you're close. I didn't know how to respond. The words caught in my throat, and his gaze felt cold. I won't say anything, he added. But Megan, this could end badly. You know that, don't you? That evening, Trevor left, leaving behind a heavy silence. When Luke returned, I told him everything. He stayed calm, but I saw a spark of determination in his eyes. We can't live in fear, he said firmly. None of this matters if we know this is right. We stood on the porch for a long time, watching the stars disappear behind clouds. Luke held my hand, and I felt his warmth melt away my doubts. Luke, what happens next? I asked quietly. What happens next? He smiled, more confidently than I'd ever seen him. We live the way we want. This is our life, Megan. In that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Life doesn't always unfold the way you expect. Sometimes it throws unexpected twists your way, and sometimes it brings the right people into your life at the right time. Trevor might have been a threat, but his words only solidified our resolve to fight for what we'd found. This summer was the beginning of something new. We walked back into the house, leaving the starlight behind. Rich snorted softly outside, and I knew this night would be different. The future was uncertain, but we had already decided to face it together.